The glass doors of the penthouse opened to reveal a world most people only saw in movies. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting rainbow patterns across marble floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. Vincent Blackwood stood at the center of it all, a man who had everything money could buy and the attitude that came with it. He adjusted his custom-made tuxedo and surveyed his guests with the satisfaction of a king watching his court. Tech executives, fashion designers, movie stars, and politicians filled his Manhattan penthouse. They sipped champagne that cost more per bottle than some people made in a week, all gathered for what Vincent called his annual charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him well. Vincent donated to charity the way other people left tips, enough to look good, but never enough to actually hurt his wallet. Tonight's cause was music education for underprivileged kids, a topic he'd chosen simply because it sounded noble and would photograph well for the society pages. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced, tapping his champagne glass with a silver spoon. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to their host. "Thank you all for joining me tonight in support of our young musicians. Your generosity will surely make a difference in their lives." The crowd murmured polite appreciation, while Vincent smiled his practiced smile. He lived for moments like these when he could feel the weight of his influence, the way people hung on his every word simply because of the numbers in his bank account. As the formal speeches ended and the mingling resumed, Vincent's eyes wandered across the room looking for his next source of entertainment. He had a habit of finding ways to amuse himself at these gatherings, often at other people's expense. His gaze landed on a figure sitting quietly in the corner, someone who clearly didn't belong. A teenage girl sat alone on one of his antique chairs, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple black dress that looked like it came from a department store, not the designer boutiques his other guests frequented. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, and she seemed to be trying very hard to make herself invisible. Vincent's interest was immediately piqued. He prided himself on knowing everyone worth knowing, but this girl was a complete mystery. She looked nervous, out of place, like she was afraid to touch anything in case she broke it. Perfect. He made his way over to where she sat, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. As he approached, he noticed her looking toward the kitchen area where the catering staff moved efficiently between the guests, carrying trays of appetizers and refilling drinks. "Well, well," Vincent said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "And who might you be, young lady? I don't believe we've been introduced." The girl looked up, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, I'm Arya," she said quietly. "Arya Martinez. My mother is working tonight. She's with the catering company." Vincent's smile widened. This was even better than he'd hoped. The daughter of the help, somehow managing to sneak into his exclusive party. The other guests were starting to notice their conversation, turning to see what their host found so interesting about this obviously out-of-place teenager. "How wonderful," Vincent said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "And how exactly did you manage to find yourself at my little gathering, Arya?" The girl's cheeks flushed pink. "My mother brought me. She said it would be okay if I stayed quiet and didn't bother anyone. She's working late tonight and there was nobody to watch me at home." Of course, Vincent nodded as if this made perfect sense. Inside, he was calculating how to make the most of this unexpected gift. Here was someone with no power, no connections, no ability to fight back. Someone he could embarrass for the amusement of his wealthy friends without any consequences. More guests were gathering now, drawn by the curiosity of seeing their host engaged in conversation with someone so obviously beneath his social class. Vincent could feel their attention, their anticipation. They all knew him well enough to sense when he was building up to one of his famous put-downs. "Tell me, Arya," Vincent continued, his voice growing louder so more people could hear. "What do you think of my little party? Rather different from what you're used to, I imagine." Arya glanced around the room, taking in the expensive artwork, the designer clothes, the casual display of wealth that surrounded her. "It's very beautiful, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you for letting me stay." Her politeness only encouraged Vincent further. The girl was being respectful, even grateful, which would make what he was planning even more entertaining. He could practically feel the anticipation building among his guests, like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on a particularly interesting show. "You know," Vincent said, gesturing broadly toward the magnificent grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. "Tonight is all about supporting music education. That gorgeous instrument over there cost more than most cars. A genuine Steinway, imported directly from Germany. It's been played by some of the world's most talented pianists." Arya followed his gaze to the piano, and Vincent noticed something flicker in her expression. Interest, maybe? Or was it longing? Either way, he had found his angle. "I don't suppose you've ever seen anything quite like it before," Vincent continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone that his regular guests recognized immediately. "It's probably worth more than your mother makes in several years." The comment hit its mark. Arya's face went pale and she looked down at her hands. Around them, Vincent's guests shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. Some looked excited by the upcoming spectacle, while others seemed slightly disturbed by their host's obvious cruelty. Vincent was just getting started. He had found his evening's entertainment, and he intended to milk every moment of it. The girl was trapped here with nowhere to go, dependent on her mother's job for their livelihood. She couldn't fight back without risking her mother's employment, and everyone in the room knew it. This was going to be fun. Vincent could feel the energy in the room shifting. His guests sensed something was about to happen, the way people do when they smell rain in the air before a storm. Conversations grew quieter, and more eyes turned toward the corner where he stood with the obviously uncomfortable teenager. He loved this feeling. The power to command a room full of important people with nothing more than his presence and reputation. These were people who controlled companies, influenced politics, and shaped culture. Yet here they were, waiting to see what Vincent Blackwood would do next. "You know what, Arya?" Vincent said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. "Since tonight is all about supporting music education, I think we should have a little demonstration. What better way to show our commitment to helping young people than by giving one a chance to perform?" Arya's eyes widened with alarm. "Oh, no, sir, I couldn't. I wouldn't want to interrupt your party." "Nonsense." Vincent waved away her protest with theatrical enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "I'd like you all to gather around. We're going to have a special performance tonight." The crowd began to move closer, champagne glasses in hand, curiosity written on their faces. Vincent noticed how some of them exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen him do this before, picking on someone weaker for his own amusement. Some seemed excited by the upcoming spectacle, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Mr. Blackwood, please," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I really shouldn't. My mother told me to stay quiet and not draw attention." "Your mother will be fine," Vincent said with a dismissive wave. "In fact, I'm sure she'll be proud to see her daughter entertaining such distinguished guests. Think of it as a career opportunity." From the kitchen doorway, Arya's mother had noticed the commotion. Carmen Martinez stood frozen, her hands gripping a serving tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She could see exactly what was happening, but was powerless to stop it. One word of protest and she'd lose the job her family desperately needed. Vincent gestured grandly toward the piano. "This magnificent instrument has been played by concert pianists, Grammy winners, and world-renowned musicians. Tonight we're going to let our young friend here give it a try." "I don't really play piano, sir," Arya said, her voice shaking slightly. "I mean, I've had some lessons, but nothing fancy. Certainly nothing good enough for your guests." Vincent's smile grew wider. This was exactly the response he'd been hoping for. "Oh, come now. Don't be modest. Any child can plunk out a tune or two. Mary Had a Little Lamb, perhaps? Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? I'm sure our guests would be delighted with whatever you can manage." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, finally understanding the full cruelty of what they were witnessing. A few looked away, suddenly finding their champagne glasses very interesting. "I'll tell you what," Vincent continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "To make this more interesting, I'll offer a little incentive." He pulled out his wallet, an expensive leather piece that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. With exaggerated movements, he extracted a crisp $100 bill. $100, he announced, holding the bill up so everyone could see. "Just for trying. All you have to do is sit at that piano and play something. Anything at all. How's that for generous?" The gesture was perfectly calculated to maximize humiliation, To most people in the room, $100 was nothing, barely worth bending over to pick up off the street. But to a teenager whose mother worked catering jobs to make ends meet, it represented real money. Vincent was making it clear that he expected her to perform like a trained animal for scraps. "What do you say, everyone?" Vincent asked, turning to address his audience. "Should we encourage our young musician to give us a little performance?" A few guests clapped politely, not wanting to anger their host but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others remained silent, unwilling to participate in what was obviously meant as entertainment at the girl's expense. Aria looked desperately toward the kitchen, catching her mother's eye. Carmen's expression was heartbreaking, a mixture of anger, helplessness, and apology. She gave her daughter a tiny nod, a signal that said she had no choice but to go along with whatever Vincent wanted. "I really don't think I should," Aria tried one more time. "I'm not good enough to play for people like this. I just embarrass myself." "Embarrass yourself?" Vincent laughed, a sound without warmth. "My dear girl, how could playing music possibly be embarrassing? Music is beautiful, uplifting. Even if you make a few mistakes, we're all friends here." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew this wasn't about friendship or encouragement. This was about a powerful man amusing himself by making a powerless girl squirm for the entertainment of his equally powerful friends. "Besides," Vincent added, his tone becoming slightly sharper, "your mother works very hard to provide for your family. I'm sure she'd appreciate knowing that her daughter was brave enough to take advantage of an opportunity when it was offered." The threat was subtle but clear. Refuse to play, and there might be consequences for her mother's job. Vincent had trapped her perfectly, using her family's financial vulnerability as leverage to force her compliance. Around the room, Vincent's guests watched the scene unfold with varying degrees of comfort. Some looked genuinely disturbed by what they were witnessing, while others seemed fascinated by the power play. A few had their phones out, probably planning to share the story at their next social gathering. Vincent walked over to the piano bench and patted it invitingly. "Come on, Aria, don't keep our guests waiting. Just a simple song and you'll have earned yourself some spending money." The teenager looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, feeling trapped like an animal in a cage. These people lived in a world where $100 was pocket change, where they could buy and sell her entire life without thinking twice about it. They were waiting to see her fail, to watch her struggle, to confirm their own superiority. But Vincent had miscalculated. He assumed that because Aria looked nervous and out of place because she came from a working-class family, because she had no power or connections, she would crumble under pressure. He expected her to stumble through a simple children's song, maybe cry a little, certainly provide the kind of awkward entertainment that would have his guests talking for weeks. What he didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess from looking at this quiet girl in her simple dress, was that Aria Martinez had been hiding something extraordinary her entire life. Aria stood up from her chair slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The room had gone completely quiet except for the soft clinking of champagne glasses and the distant sounds of traffic far below. Every eye was on her, waiting to see what would happen next. She walked toward the piano, each step feeling like it took forever. Vincent followed beside her, his smile growing wider with each passing second. He was already imagining how this would play out, how she would stumble through some basic tune while his guests politely pretended to enjoy it. The piano bench felt cold beneath her as she sat down. The instrument was indeed magnificent, its black surface polished to such a shine that she could see her own reflection staring back at her. The keys were perfectly white and black, arranged in the familiar pattern she knew better than her own heartbeat. "Take your time," Vincent said loudly, making sure everyone could hear his fake encouragement. "Remember, just something simple. We're not expecting Carnegie Hall here." A few guests chuckled at his comment, though the laughter sounded forced and uncomfortable. Most of them were still trying to figure out exactly what they were watching, whether they should feel entertained or disturbed. Aria placed her hands on the keys but didn't press down yet. She closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to block out the watching faces, the expensive clothes, the weight of everyone's expectations. In her mind, she was back in the small practice room at the community center, the place where she'd spent countless hours after school while her mother worked. That's where she discovered something that changed everything about who she was. 3 years ago, when she was just 13, She'd wandered into that practice room to escape the noise of the other after-school programs. There was an old beat-up piano in the corner that nobody seemed to care about. The keys stuck sometimes, and several of them were badly out of tune, but it was still a piano. She'd started by pressing random keys, just enjoying the sounds. Within weeks, she was picking out simple melodies by ear. Within months, she was teaching herself complex pieces by watching videos online and practicing for hours every day. She had something that couldn't be taught or bought, something that had nothing to do with expensive lessons or fancy instruments. She had talent, real, extraordinary talent, but she'd never told anyone. Not her mother, not her teachers, not her few friends at school. It was her secret, her escape, her private world where she could be someone different from the quiet girl whose family struggled to pay rent every month. Now, sitting at Vincent's expensive piano with dozens of wealthy strangers staring at her, she made a decision that surprised even herself. If he wanted a performance, she would give him one, just not the kind he was expecting. Arya opened her eyes and positioned her hands properly on the keys. Then, without any announcement or explanation, she began to play. The first notes filled the room like liquid silver, not the simple children's song Vincent had suggested, not some basic tune that a beginner might stumble through. Instead, she launched into one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire. The music that poured from the piano was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece that professional pianists spent years perfecting. Her fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace and precision, each note crystal clear and perfectly timed. The melody soared and dipped, carrying emotions that seemed far too mature for someone her age. Vincent's smug smile vanished completely. His mouth actually fell open as he watched this girl he'd planned to humiliate play with the skill of a concert pianist. Around the room, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People who had been half listening while checking their phones now stared in complete amazement. The music wasn't just technically perfect. It was beautiful in a way that made something deep inside each listener respond. Arya played with her eyes closed now, lost in the piece, her whole body moving slightly with the rhythm. She wasn't performing for the crowd anymore. She was simply being herself, the self she'd hidden away for so long. As the piece developed, building to its dramatic climaxes and falling back to gentle whispers, something magical happened in that room. The artificial social barriers that usually define these gatherings began to dissolve. It didn't matter anymore who was wearing designer clothes or who had arrived in the most expensive car. Everyone was simply human, listening to something that spoke directly to their hearts. Vincent stood frozen, watching his carefully planned humiliation transform into something he never could have imagined. This wasn't supposed to happen. The girl was supposed to be embarrassed, not extraordinary. She was supposed to confirm his superiority, not challenge everything he thought he knew about worth and talent. Near the kitchen doorway, Carmen Martinez had tears streaming down her face. She had no idea her daughter could play like this. All those afternoons when Arya said she was staying late at school for homework. All those times she came home humming melodies that Carmen didn't recognize. Her little girl had been hiding an incredible gift. The music built to its final thunderous crescendo, Arya's hands moving so fast they seemed to blur. Every note rang out perfectly clear, even in the most technically demanding passages. Then gradually the piece wound down to its gentle, haunting conclusion. When the last note faded into silence, the room remained completely quiet for several long seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then slowly someone began to clap. Then another person joined in. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause unlike anything Vincent's parties had ever heard. This wasn't polite social clapping. This was genuine appreciation for something truly remarkable. Several guests were openly crying. Others were shaking their heads in amazement. A famous conductor who was among the guests looked like he'd just witnessed a miracle. People were pulling out their phones not to gossip or mock, but to try to capture some memory of what they just experienced. Vincent stood in the middle of it all, completely speechless. The $100 bill was still in his hand, but now it looked pathetic rather than generous. What could money possibly mean to someone with a gift like this? Arya opened her eyes and looked around the room as if waking up from a dream. The applause continued for what felt like forever, and she seemed genuinely surprised by the reaction. She stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs, still not quite believing what had just happened. For the first time in his adult life, Vincent Blackwood felt completely and utterly small. Not because someone had more money than him, or more social status, or more business success. He felt small because he'd encountered something real, something genuine, something that made all his wealth and power seem meaningless by comparison. The girl he'd tried to humiliate had just given everyone in the room a gift they would remember for the rest of their lives, and in doing so, she'd shown him exactly who he really was. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade. As the clapping died down, something extraordinary happened. Instead of returning to their previous conversations and social circles, Vincent's guests began moving toward Arya. Dr. Helena Chen, one of the country's most respected music critics, was the first to approach. Her eyes were still bright with tears from the performance. "My dear," she said softly, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Arya looked overwhelmed, still trying to process what had just happened. "I taught myself mostly. There's a piano at the community center where I go after school. I watch videos online and practice whenever I can." "You taught yourself?" Dr. Chen looked stunned. "That piece you just played?" "Professional pianists spend months preparing it for concerts. I've heard it performed at Carnegie Hall by world-renowned artists, and your interpretation was absolutely breathtaking." More guests crowded around, all wanting to speak with this remarkable young woman they'd initially dismissed as an outsider. Robert Vale, a Broadway producer, pushed gently through the small crowd. "Arya, is it?" "I've been in the music business for 30 years, and I can honestly say I've never heard anything quite like what you just did." Vincent watched from a few feet away, still clutching the $100 bill that now seemed more insulting than generous. Every word of praise for Arya felt like a judgment against him. These were his friends, his social circle, people who usually hung on his every word. Now they were completely ignoring him in favor of the girl he'd tried to embarrass. "Have you ever considered professional training?" asked Professor Williams from the local conservatory. "With talent like yours, you could be performing with major orchestras within a few years." Arya shook her head, looking almost scared by the suggestion. "Oh no, that's not possible. Lessons are expensive, and my family, we can't afford things like that." "Nonsense," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Talent like yours doesn't come along very often. There are scholarships, grants, programs specifically designed for gifted students who need financial assistance." Vincent felt something twist in his stomach as he listened. Here was this girl, this incredible young artist, talking about not being able to afford music lessons while standing in his penthouse, surrounded by artwork worth millions of dollars. The contrast was so sharp it made him physically uncomfortable. Carmen Martinez had been watching from the kitchen doorway, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Important people, wealthy people, were talking to her daughter like she mattered, like she was special. Finally, she worked up the courage to approach the group. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the excited conversations. "I'm Arya's mother." The crowd immediately made space for her, and Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "Mrs. Martinez, you must be so proud. Your daughter has an extraordinary gift." Carmen's eyes filled with tears again. "I had no idea she could play like that. She never told me. All this time I thought she was just doing homework at the community center." "Mom," Arya said softly, taking her mother's hand, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to worry about something else we couldn't afford." The simple statement hit Vincent like a physical blow. While he was throwing $100,000 parties and buying artwork he barely looked at, this girl was hiding her incredible talent because she was worried about her family's finances. Professor Williams was already pulling out his business card. "Mrs. Martinez, I'd like to talk with you about our scholarship programs. Someone with Arya's abilities absolutely should be receiving professional training. And I know several youth orchestras that would love to audition her," added Robert Vale. "There are performance opportunities, competitions with cash prizes, summer programs." Vincent watched the excited planning happening around Arya and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Real deep shame that made his face burn and his hands shake slightly. These people weren't just being polite. They were genuinely excited about helping this girl, about nurturing her talent, about giving her opportunities. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of enthusiasm about helping someone else? The evening that had started as Vincent's show, his party with his rules, had become completely transformed. Small groups of guests clustered around Arya, asking about her music, sharing stories of performances they'd loved, making connections and suggestions for her future. Vincent found himself standing alone for the first time in years at one of his own parties. Usually he was the center of attention, the one everyone wanted to talk to and impress. Tonight he'd become irrelevant in his own home. Dr. Chen approached him, her expression serious. "Vincent, I hope you realize what just happened here." He looked at her, not trusting himself to speak. "That young woman has the kind of talent that comes along maybe once in a generation," she continued. "She could be performing with the world's greatest orchestras. She could inspire millions of people with her music, and she's been hiding it because her family can't afford proper training." Vincent nodded, still unable to find words. "What you did tonight," Dr. Chen said more quietly, "asking her to play, putting her on the spot like that. It could have gone very badly. She could have been humiliated. But instead, you accidentally gave her the greatest gift possible. You gave her a chance to show the world who she really is." The word accidentally stung because it was absolutely true. Vincent hadn't meant to help Arya. He'd meant to embarrass her for his own entertainment. The fact that it had turned out well was pure luck, not kindness on his part. Across the room, Arya was now sitting back at the piano, playing something softer and more gentle for a small audience of guests who had pulled chairs close to listen. Her mother stood nearby, beaming with pride and still wiping away occasional tears. Vincent realized with a sinking feeling that everyone in the room understood exactly what had happened tonight. They'd all seen him try to humiliate this girl. They'd all witnessed his cruel attempt at entertainment. The fact that it had backfired so spectacularly didn't erase his original intentions. For the first time in his adult life, Vincent Blackwood felt truly ashamed of himself. And worse than that, he realized he deserved to feel ashamed. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Vincent found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He was truly listening to other people talk, not just waiting for his turn to speak or thinking about how their words affected him. Arya was still at the piano, now playing gentle background music while the remaining guests chatted quietly. The atmosphere had completely changed from the formal charity gala Vincent had planned. It felt warmer somehow, more real, like actual human connections were being made instead of just business, cards being exchanged. Professor Williams was deep in conversation with Carmen Martinez about scholarship applications and audition requirements. Dr. Chen was writing down contact information for summer music programs. Robert Vale was already talking about having Arya audition for a young artist's showcase he was producing. Vincent watched it all happen, feeling more like an outsider at his own party than Arya had ever been. But this time, being on the outside gave him a perspective he'd never had before. He could see clearly now how his wealth and influence had created a barrier between him and genuine human connection. When the last guest finally left, it was nearly midnight. Carmen was gathering her catering supplies in the kitchen, while Arya sat quietly on the couch looking exhausted but happy. Vincent knew this was his moment. If he was going to say something, anything to make up for what he'd done, it had to be now. He walked over to where Arya sat, the crumpled $100 bill still in his hand. When he looked at it now, it seemed like evidence of his cruelty rather than his generosity. "Arya," he said softly, sitting down across from her, "I owe you an apology." She looked up at him with those same dark eyes that had seemed so nervous hours earlier. Now they held something different. Not confidence exactly, but a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "I brought you up to that piano tonight for all the wrong reasons," Vincent continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you would embarrass yourself, and I wanted to watch it happen. I wanted to use your discomfort to entertain my friends." Arya didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. "What you did instead," Vincent went on, "was show me something I'd forgotten existed. You showed me what real talent looks like, what real grace looks like. You turned my attempt at cruelty into something beautiful." He held out the $100 bill, but not as payment. "This was supposed to be your reward for performing like a trained animal for my amusement. It's insulting now, isn't it? After what you showed us tonight, this seems like nothing." Arya looked at the money but didn't take it. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't need to apologize. What happened tonight, it was good for me. Those people, they want to help me learn music properly. That never would have happened if I hadn't played." Her kindness made Vincent feel even worse. She was being generous to him when he deserved nothing but anger. "That doesn't change what I intended to do," he said firmly, "and it doesn't change what I need to do now to make it right." Over the next few days, Vincent did something he'd never done before. He spent time researching. Really researching, not just having assistants prepare reports for him. He learned about music education programs, scholarship funds, and the challenges facing talented young people from low-income families. What he discovered horrified him. There were thousands of kids like Arya, maybe with gifts just as extraordinary, who would never get a chance to develop their talents because their families couldn't afford proper training. Meanwhile, he spent more on a single piece of artwork than most music programs received in funding for an entire year. 2 weeks after the party, Vincent called Carmen Martinez and asked if he could meet with her and Arya. Not at his penthouse this time, but at their apartment. He wanted to see how they actually lived, to understand the reality of their situation. The apartment was small but incredibly clean and well-maintained. Carmen had clearly worked hard to make it a comfortable home for her daughter. Vincent noticed immediately that there was no piano, no musical instruments of any kind. Arya had developed her extraordinary talent without even having an instrument to practice on at home. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the party," Vincent told them both. "And I've realized that what I witnessed that night wasn't just talent. It was determination, dedication, and pure love of music. Arya, you've been teaching yourself to play pieces that challenge professional musicians, using an old piano at a community center and videos on the internet." Arya nodded, still a bit shy around him despite everything that had happened. "I want to do something," Vincent continued. "Not because I feel guilty, though I do. Not because I want people to think I'm generous, though I hope they will. I want to do it because what I saw that night changed how I think about everything." He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Carmen. "I've set up a full scholarship fund, not just for Arya, but for other young musicians who have talent but not opportunity. The initial funding will cover music lessons, instruments, performance opportunities, and eventually college tuition for students who qualify." Carmen opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was documentation for a fund worth $2 million. "But that's not all," Vincent said, pulling out his phone. "I've also purchased something that I hope Arya will accept." Through the window they could see a delivery truck pulling up outside their building. 2 men began unloading something large and carefully wrapped. "It's a piano," Vincent explained. "Nothing as fancy as the one at my penthouse, but it's a good instrument. Professional quality. Arya, you shouldn't have to sneak practice time on a broken-down piano at a community center. You should have your own." Arya burst into tears, but they were happy tears this time. Carmen wrapped her arms around her daughter, both of them overwhelmed by this unexpected turn their lives had taken. 6 months later, Vincent received an invitation to Arya's first official recital. She had been accepted into an advanced music program and was already performing with a youth orchestra. The invitation was simple and handwritten, but it meant more to him than any of the expensive galas he'd ever hosted. He sat in the audience that night, watching this remarkable young woman play for a crowd that had come specifically to hear her music. There was no cruelty here, no ulterior motives, just pure appreciation for something beautiful. As Arya took her bow to thunderous applause, Vincent realized that the girl who was supposed to be his victim had actually been his teacher. She'd shown him that real worth had nothing to do with money or power. It had to do with character, talent, and the courage to be yourself even when the whole world is watching. That night had changed both their lives forever.